So with the statue situation right now, debates really are flying regarding imperialism and um, basically Western powers and their history. And this is uniquely focused against Western powers. I mean, there's no calls to remove the statues of Chairman Mao across China. Um, of course, it would be obvious what would happen to protesters who tried that in China. But some of the latest examples of this are the statue of James Cook, Captain James Cook in Sydney, being targeted, and in Belgium, in Brussels, the statue of King Leopold II. Now, Leopold II absolutely is one of the worst tyrants of the 20th century. This was a man who was personally complicit in the brutal exploitation of Congolese in rubber plantations. Um, and the punishments meted out for workers who were deemed to not be working hard enough, and other such charges where it was, brutal amputation of limbs. There's no question about it. The Belgian record in the Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, later became Zaire, now the DRC, is absolutely appalling. One of the ugliest examples of European colonial power. So, in the case of Leopold II, I'm definitely not going to forcefully defend his record. But I think maybe a compromise situation or an approach to that could have been um, some sort of plaque or some sort of information board showing his record. Belgium needs to be come clean about that, absolutely. And so does Britain. I mean, we need to be absolutely upfront about the records of all of our historic figures, but I still am not sure that the removal of statues is the best course of action. Um, but anyway, among these debates came up the subject of reparations. Um, I mean, it's quite incredible when you think about all of this, it seems, has spanned out of the death of a black man in Minneapolis. It seems to just all have been a domino effect or a trigger effect. Quite incredible. Would this have happened without the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis? Maybe, but I'm not sure. Um, it's quite astonishing. But anyway, on the issue of reparations, yeah, so there have been calls for Britain, modern Britain, to make reparations to India in the tune of, I believe the figure quoted is 45 trillion for the roughly 200 years we were the imperial power in India. We took dominance of India after the Battle of Plassey in 1757 during the Seven Years' War. The Dutch basically got control of what was then the Dutch East Indies, later Indonesia, and the British took control of what later became India. It's important actually, this is a very important point. India at that time was not a unified state. It was made up of a collection of princely states and small kingdoms. So the idea of a single unified India is a misnomer actually. And that is also true of what happened a century later when the British East India Company ceded control directly to the Crown after what is termed the Indian Mutiny of 1857. In Indian circles, it's called the First Indian War of Independence. But both terms are arguably contentious because India was not a unified state. So it's difficult to describe it as the Indian Mutiny or the Indian War of Independence because there was different princely states. Some were allied to the British, some were opposing the British. Um, I mean, in the case of Victoria and Abdul, there was, of course, the film Victoria and Abdul showed situation here in which there was different allegiances between the Sikhs and the Hindus and the Muslims regarding um, their sentiments towards the British and the mutiny. So this wasn't clear cut. There were pro-British Indians, there were anti-British Indians. Um, But anyway, it's, self-determination was ultimately the path that Gandhi and other leaders took India down. India became independent in 1947. There was bloody partition, and so on. I can give a history lesson here, but I won't. It would take a long time, and I'm not qualified to do that either. I can't claim that I am. It would be false for me to pretend I'm really an academic um, on this. I'm not. I know the basics, but I think with the issue of reparations, there's an obvious question that comes up, which is if Britain pays out reparations to India. This has been a call for a number of years by Indians from both left and right, and even some Britons have taken this position. But Indians on both left and right, one example is Shashi Tharoor has been quite outspoken on this. He's an Indian politician born in London, prominent Indian politician. Here's the problem. If let's just say, okay, morally, Britain owes India 45 trillion for the years that we colonized India. How's that allocated? Because then you get into complex questions about, well, you just give over this money, right? Or even if it's done over a period of time. Um, there's going to be some states, for example, Uttar Pradesh is far more populous than some of the southern states, and states that are now actually trying to get independence from India, like Nagaland. Um, I think it could potentially actually open up old wounds between conflicts within India. It could actually lead to a lot of resentment over how that money is allocated. Um, I mean, India's had numerous separatist campaigns in its post-independence history. If Britain suddenly gave 45 trillion over a period of time, and we couldn't afford that anyway, the entire British economy is estimated to be about 3 trillion, so we couldn't practically do it anyway. Um, but even if we did, I think it would actually lead to a lot of tensions within India as to how it's allocated. Um, but here's another problem. Do you then apply the same principle to every empire in history? I mean, under this principle, modern Mongolia, the Republic of Mongolia, would have to pay reparations out to Central Asian countries like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan because they are now occupying the land that was not occupying. They are on the land of the people who were subjugated by the Mongol conquests. Millions died in those conquests, and the remnants of that can still be seen to this day in Western China, what's now Xinjiang, and in many parts of Central Asia. Those cultures that were ravished by the Mongols never fully recovered, never. So arguably the legacy of that could be still seen to this day. Now, it's going to be demands from Mongolia to pay reparations as a successor state, and they're very proud of Genghis Khan. Um, what about other European powers? France was a major colonial power, Portugal certainly, Belgium. I mean, the list goes on. I personally think that European countries have a moral obligation to carry out their aid commitments. Wealthy countries, in my opinion, do have a moral obligation to to contribute to their aid commitments, and certainly there is a moral obligation to help former colonized countries. So, in the case of Belgium, there's a moral obligation there to DRC. In the case of Britain, there's a moral obligation to India, to Pakistan, to Kenya, to all the lands we colonized. Um, But I just think that this gets into a very grey area, certainly in terms of the allocation, certainly in terms of the practicality. Like I say, the entire British economy is about 3 trillion. So we couldn't practically do it. It just couldn't be done to the sort of demands, the sort of figures that are being quoted. But here's my contention as well. India today is a powerful country. It has its own space program. Britain already gives India millions in aid. Um, I do not see why we should give India reparations today. Um, I think there is a cause for reparations to direct victims of British colonial crimes. So, for example, in the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, um, I do think that we probably should pay out settlements to survivors of that time. I know not everyone will agree with that, um, but you know, there are older people now, there's not that many of them. I don't think it would bankrupt Britain to pay out reparations to those people. Or to, I mean, with Amritsar, it's 101 years ago now. I doubt there will be any direct survivors of that event. Their descendants, well, where do you draw the line? I mean, do you draw the line at the children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, great great grandchildren? I think there has to be a cut-off point of reason. Otherwise, if you keep doing it, if you keep saying, oh, well, it's generational, well, then literally people in my region could claim reparations from Norway and Denmark for Viking pillage. And I'm not even saying that flippantly because it's a serious point about the generational argument. That is to say, their descendants need to be paid back for what happened then. You know, it starts to get very, very murky. I think we should recognise our colonial wrongs. I know David Cameron visited Amritsar in 2013. He stopped short of a full apology. I've mixed feelings about that. I mean, on one hand, David Cameron was born in the 1960s, long before the event even happened. Um, so the idea that he personally apologized, or even that he apologized on behalf of the UK as the Prime Minister at that time, would seem to be almost vacuous. But as a gesture, maybe he should have. I don't know. I've mixed feelings about that. Um, But you know, Indians who are pushing this, my question to them would be, well, okay, are you going to then demand reparation for the empire before the British, the Mughal Empire? You know, they killed potentially millions of Hindus in India. Um, every empire in human history has blood on its hands. Every empire in human history was motivated by self-interest. I think the British get focused on because we were the biggest. So naturally, there's a lot of focus on that. But the idea of reparations, I just think it's all very well saying, well, the British were a huge empire, so they should just pay out millions to the lands they colonized. I think that's overly simplistic. I think we've a moral obligation. And I do feel that Britain is a pretty generous country. We do give out millions in aid. And we should. I don't begrudge that. I don't agree with those who say we just should cut off foreign aid. I do think we have an obligation to those countries we colonized. But I think that this issue is. I mean, I'm not convinced that a country that has its own space program needs reparations today. I'm sorry, but I'm just not.